Hi, everyone. I'm Raina Hornaday. Thanks for having me. I'm on the board of Powerhouse Texas and also work with Garrett at American Farmland Trust on training and helping landowners that want to entertain solar for farmland. So thrilled to be here. I think education's one of the most important things in the energy industry across the board. Happy to work with Dr. Edelman here. And I know we gave you some homework. Wanted to just see if you had any questions on any of the readings that we gave you or the homework we gave you, or any intro questions you would like to have before we get started. That's what I thought that the response would be. Oh, okay.
In the DOE's siting thing, it said that part of the planning is how long that they'll last, the renewable projects. So for a solar project, how long does it last? I don't. For some reason, I would have thought forever. But
okay, that's
or 100
good
years.
Question.
What is it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So our leases are usually 20-year. We have 15-year terms with 2 5-year extensions. That's more for batteries. Solar's 25 years normally, but then there's extensions that can be part of that agreement. It's a great question. We get that every single time when we start the development of projects. It's somewhat negotiable. The other question that's in line with that one that we often get is, what is the life of the technology? So that goes into the life of the project, because same with wind. There's repower. A wind project might last for 20 or 30 years, but along the way, technology might need to be repowered along the way. So that's a big part of it as well. But great question. I would say 20 years and 25 years, and then what you do after with decommissioning and restoring the soil, like Garrett was referring to make sure we can return it back to how it was, is a big part of our development from the beginning as well. But did you have something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intuition is reasonable. Like, you putting this really expensive infrastructure in place, including substations and things like that. And so the assumption is that it would be forever, but the lease terms are limited. I mean, I assume most projects will continue to operate. They'll just renegotiate another round of leases. But Raina was telling us about the development, wind development on your land, and it was a combination of technological changes that really shifted it. So after the 20-year operation lifetime, they actually didn't repower the system at that point. So probably it's going to be site specific. I would imagine most places, if you've got a big solar project or wind project, that it will just be this cycle of renegotiating leases and repowering as new technology comes online too.
But we're not there really yet. I mean,
no, we
the
aren't.
Wind projects that were built in 1999, 2000, they're still operating.
Yeah.
Most of them are still operating. So I'm sure they've had many different rounds of new blades. But my project in New Mexico was unique. It was wind turbines that couldn't be kind of repowered. So it was decommissioned. And so that's a lot of what you guys will hear about also with all these technologies, is what is the decommissioning plan, who pays for it, who's responsible for it. So that's a great question. If you haven't had time to go through these, I really recommend them. And I didn't, is that yours, the Texas Energy Story, or
Yeah.
are these mine? Okay. Any other questions about the homework? Okay. So Garrett's familiar with this project. I'm proud of it. It's a tiny project, but it's in Rio Grande Valley, and it was a partnership with one of my companies in UTRGV, a grant that UTRGV received to look at the benefits and the impact of solar on farms. This is a vineyard, so my favorite kind of farm. No, not really, but a good kind of test case. So UTRGV is testing the water, the soil, the heat in the plants, the carbon, things that normally we wouldn't really think about. So this is not a utility scale project, but I think it could lead to utility scale projects as they relate to agrivoltaics once we get research from projects like these. There was supposed to be a number of them. but administration changed, so we only got a couple, they only were able to have funding for a couple of these small projects, but it's still gonna give us quite a bit of data that we just don't have. So is everyone, agrivoltaics, is that a new word for anyone in here? Is everyone familiar with agrivoltaics? Yes? Okay, good. So today, I'm a developer. I've developed wind, solar, and now I'm doing battery energy storage projects in ERCOT. Done some in New Mexico, but ERCOT's, if you wonder why there's so much development here, we're going to go through kind of why so many developers from all over the world come here. It's a pretty development-friendly space. We're going to go over misconceptions, responsible siting, what we think is the best approach to siting these projects, which is going to come up for you guys as we get into the session and some of these bills come up that are anti or any kind of energy bills. Risk management, technology, fire safety is a big thing, as you all know, recycling, wind turbines, all of it, blades and solar panels and battery storage. Recycling is a big issue. And then water use, another huge issue. And the policy choices, we're going to go over those. So this is a solar panel. Again, I don't know if I put a utility scale example in here, but happy to provide that for you. My biggest project was 300 megawatts in Goliad County. And I do have a slide of a layout of that project, but this is on my ranch in New Mexico. It powers my barn, which is also my house. So I'm proud of solar. I often say landowners, before there were transmission lines, many of them how they had power was individual wind turbine generators, small ones. And my grandparents had solar panels that actually still produce a tiny bit of solar. They look terrible, but so wind and solar for farmers and ranchers is not a new thing. That was kind of the original resources that they used. So happy to utilize that on our place in eastern New Mexico. So this, I did try to move those boxes, but we're just going over assumptions, things that kind of, misconceptions out there. So federal permitting, that's one reason that's easy to build and develop in Texas. There aren't a lot of federal permitting. If you're developing projects rurally, you don't have a lot of hoops to jump through there. So we're going to go over that. Counties, we do a lot of these big projects in unincorporated areas, so we are, site specific is a lot of what we'll talk about today. Projects, whether they're in AJVs or in communities, cities, municipalities, that's what dictates often what we go through as far as permitting and zoning. Big misconception is that solar kills productive land, farmland. We have American Farmland Trust here. They're really driving the conversation and helping inform communities and landowners on how they can benefit from having an energy project on their land. And there's lots of economic benefits. I wanted to give some other homework. There's been studies done on the positive financial impact of rural communities from renewables. Highly recommend those studies that you can look at and reference, because it's been huge all throughout Texas. So how are sites for renewables chosen and what are the current limits? This is another one of the UTRGV projects. It's a C&J farm, so they have just different crops under these panels, very small, but again, it's for research so we can grow the size of agrivoltaic projects. So land control, I don't know how much you guys know or don't know about how renewable development works, but whether it's wind, solar, or battery storage, we do a lot of research on where there's capacity in the lines, where there's availability in the substations, and that's kind of our first marker. And from there, we look at, what else is going on in the community, what other projects are around that would cause curtailment or influence our potential project, and then we look at landowners and land holdings and who owns land and what proximity to substations or transmission lines there are, and that we kind of that's the start. I tried to get Landgate here, and hopefully you guys can hear from them, but you might want to look them up. It's a great resource that we use daily. Landgate's software that shows a lot of details into areas where development is, where we want to do development, we do development. So we often go to it for a lot of different development related things, infrastructure, transmission lines, substation, landowners, crops, all that. So it's a great resource. So these are just kind of the key stack that we do for development. We're going to touch on environmental later. Interconnection, obviously SB6 is the bill of the day, talking about putting large loads together for studies. So curtailment risk, and then commercial bankability we're also going to talk about here. That's the backside of that same project. So screening, like I said, the transmission, where there's good resources, where there's open bays, where there's plenty of room for projects, and just depends, it's site specific, so it depends on the technology and also the size of the project. Diligence, we do a number of studies, we're going to go into it, but doing title work and finding out, who owns the minerals and whether there's an active lease under the land is a big part of the solar development. And I have another slide on that. So yeah, the design, fire safety is really, it does sometimes, we talk about it with solar, but obviously with battery storage, again, another topic of the day, but it's heavy on our development for battery storage, is working with local fire departments and communities on fire safety. So we're going to go over that. And then interconnection deposit, tax structure, we're going to talk about that as well. So as most of you probably know, oil and gas kind of has a preferred stack on what you want to do on the surface. So when we go do a big project, this is my project in Goliad County, we have to work with whoever owns the minerals. So we have the mineral owners, which it's not always the landowner, it's often bifurcated. And it's also, you can also have an operator. So we often have to not only get an agreement with the landowner, but we have to get an agreement with the mineral owners and the operator. And this particular project was very complicated in that there was a 1929 lease that didn't have to meet a production. So it was perpetually held in production, and that made it a lot more difficult. So we had to do set-asides and allow for future mineral extraction or pad sites throughout the solar project, even though probably won't ever happen. So that's a big part of our development process and a big part of the money that goes into this as well. So that's just this slide. It's as you can see, all the, and this isn't Landgate, but this is a part of the layout we have to do that changes over and over to get everyone into agreement. So okay, you can take over. I feel like that was forever.
No, that's fine. Great to have a chance to talk with you. So Rena's been just providing kind of an overview of project development, and part of what we're going to do now is talk about some of the details of the different stages of project development. Project development cycles are like 3 to 5 years roughly in Texas, and so a developer is trying to manage its interconnection, its negotiation with landowners, its negotiations with county governments and representatives, or a city, depending on where you're developing, as well as work through any kind of environmental permitting that's associated with or required for the project. And so I'm going to focus on that part, but you should be sort of thinking about, as a developer, you're doing all of these things in parallel. They also interact with each other. Being a developer, fortunately I'm not a developer, is incredibly difficult because you have so many balls in the air, and what's going on with one thing can impact something else. And so one of the things that we want to do in terms of thinking about policy is both streamlining it and thinking about all the different things that developers have to do so that they can be better aligned and better coordinated. At the national level, one of the central debates, if you guys follow this, is a debate both on the left, on the right. On the left, it's sort of about abundance and making government work. On the right, it's sort of a traditional aversion to pretty much any kind of regulation. And there are 3 principal regulations that impact particularly wind and solar development. They also can impact data center development as well. And they're the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Clean Water Act. And I'm going to go through this at a very high level. I'll tell you my bottom line, and the bottom line is that for the most part, most projects, most sophisticated project developers avoid anything that's typically referred to as a federal nexus, anything that requires any kind of federal permitting, and often avoid federal land as well. We live in Texas, there's not very much federal land, so federal land doesn't tend to be the issue in terms of triggering some kind of federal regulatory requirements. So I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. So the first statute is the National Environmental Policy Act. It's a purely procedural statute. From the standpoint of the local community, what it does is it provides for enhanced opportunities to understand the scope of a project, its whole variety or range of impacts associated with it. And there are different tiers of procedures depending on the environmental impacts associated with a project that the federal agency overseeing a project would have to go through. And so it can be actually a good thing used effectively to promote community engagement and better inform the community about project development. The challenge of it is if you have to go through a full environmental impact statement, it can take on the order of 2 to 4 years. And so remember, when we're sort of thinking about project development, we're hoping that it's occurring on a 3 to 5 year cycle. And so if you have to go through this full process, you're occupying a lot of that entire cycle of project development. And so there's a lot of concern about just the procedural delays associated with this type of federal regulation. The second is the Clean Water Act. It's basically, in this context, where it matters is where wetlands are being impacted. And again, there's streamlined processes, these nationwide permits, you can obtain them in like kind of weeks or on the order of months. And so they really don't hold up projects significantly. Where they can have a significant impact on a project, both in terms of costs, but also in terms of time, is if you have to get an individual permit for a project. So if you're developing a solar project or a wind project on the coast where it's wetter, you're more likely to impact wetlands, you may have to get one of these permits, and they can cost on the order of millions of dollars for wetlands impacts, mitigating them, and they take on the order of 2 years. They also have additional procedures associated with them. Virtually all projects that I know of get by with nationwide permits in Texas. There are other parts of the country where it's harder to do that, like in places like Florida. So we have streamlined processes both under the National Environmental Policy Act, we have streamlined processes under the Clean Water Act. More often than not, project developers cite their projects in part to avoid impacting or requiring permitting under a statute like the Clean Water Act. And then the final statute is the Endangered Species Act. And basically, there's certain listed species where there's strict prohibitions of taking those species. For a solar project or a battery project, that would mostly be around the construction of the project. For a big wind project, particularly impacts on protected bats and birds, that's also operational. And so there can be big long-term consequences associated with the Endangered Species Act. There is a permitting process under the Endangered Species Act that enables you to take a certain number of species if you mitigate the impacts associated with that. Again, that process, there's not, strictly speaking, a streamlined process under the Endangered Species Act. That process, again, can take 2 to 3, sometimes longer, that number of years. And so in terms of the impacts of projects, particularly wind projects, the Endangered Species Act among these 3 statutes is probably the single most important one, especially since they're species that have like enormous ranges, like most of the country, and it would be difficult to avoid citing a project where they're not potentially impacted. What have we seen so far under these statutes? So this is a study that I conducted for all projects built in the United States between 2010 and 2021. So basically a 12-year period. We had 751 wind projects, a little over 1,100 solar projects. And I'm just looking at each of these statutes. Did you need kind of the full-blown process or permit to site your project? And what you see in each of these cases is it's less than 5% of the projects were required to go through an environmental impact statement, required a Section 404 permit, or required what's referred to as an incidental take permit under the Endangered Species Act. So project developers are savvy, they have good lawyers, and they're basically working around these statutes pretty systematically, at least so far. Litigation under the statutes, again, in terms of just like the number of projects where we've seen litigation is also relatively small. For wind projects, about 3%. For solar projects, about 1%. And the volume of litigation that we've seen has actually dropped with everything except for offshore wind projects, where we've seen a lot of litigation, even till relatively recently. So the bottom line is these are really important statutes. There's certain parts of the country, even certain parts of the state, especially development on the coast, where they're going to be more important. They're most likely going to put greater constraints on project development. But for the most part, project developers have been able to work around them, and they haven't had to go through the full processes that take multiple years. Yes?
Have you left out the Clean Air Act because it's irrelevant for federal permitting, or because it's not relevant to renewables?
It's just not relevant for renewables. They don't have significant emissions associated with them. So the Clean Air Act's not a significant factor.
But for other projects, it would be taken into account in this federal permitting process, right?
Definitely, yeah. Like if you're building a data center and you're building a natural gas generator alongside that as kind of backup generation, then you would have to go through Clean Air Act permitting. And they're different, it really just depends on the size of the project. So there's some permitting that, in Texas you can get done in like 6 months to a year under the Clean Air Act. But if it's a big enough source, then you have to go through what's referred to as new source review. And that's a much more involved process. There are procedures associated with that. There can be contested case hearings as well. And that can make it a much more involved and longer process. So, yeah. Yeah.
So I see the 404 permits, and that's Clean Water Act.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I missed it, but what are the other categories, and how do those?
So an EIS is the National Environmental Policy Act. So that's the purely procedural statute. The HCPs is the Endangered Species Act. And so a habitat conservation plan, an incidental take permit, that's the kind of full-blown, non-streamlined process under the Endangered Species Act that takes, at least 2 years, often more like 2 to 3 years to get through. And so basically, I would say almost all project developers avoid that like the plague. Right? What they will do is they will modify their project or even operate it in a way that essentially eliminates the likelihood that they're going to take a species rather than go through the permitting process. Okay. From an environmental perspective, that's not a bad thing, They're sort of selecting sites to avoid impacts.
Right, but they're still having to go through and make sure that they're not impacting those.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
it's
so
an interesting.
they're not necessarily avoiding the permitting process and everything where they're getting around stuff. They're modifying their project so that it doesn't impact it and trigger those.
Yeah, and they're doing consultations with the Fish and Wildlife Service to get basically a rough handshake agreement with the service where they say, yeah, if you site the project this way and you operate it in a particular way, especially a wind project, like turn off the turbines under certain wind conditions, then we're good with you. And they actually give them a letter that says, you don't need to get a permit, and then they can finance the project at that point. Yeah.
What's the process between that and state and the federal? Is that the same process as far as permitting?
So there's no state level variant in Texas of the National Environmental Policy Act. Section 404 wetlands permits, that's kind of federal preemption. So the federal government controls permitting over wetlands. And then the Endangered Species Act, there is a state level Endangered Species Act. It just, to my knowledge, hasn't been ever, especially in Texas. There are other states where the state level laws are more important, but they've not been so important in Texas. For endangered species issues, it really is the Endangered Species Act and the federal law that controls. Okay.
We didn't talk about FAA permits.
Yeah, do you want to say, I actually haven't done much on FAA permits. So
We do have to get FAA permits for wind. It's the big deal with wind, how far you are from an airport, but also with solar because of glare. So it is a consideration, and I just thought of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it can be really important in certain areas, actually.
So it's all part of siting developments.
Yeah. So what I'm going to transition to, so the sort of short answer is the federal overlay for most renewable development is not the most important thing. It's not that there aren't consultations with the federal government, but a lot of it is more at the local level. And Texas is really distinct relative to other states in that county governments in unincorporated areas don't have zoning authority. And so there's no local permitting required, even of like a 1,000-acre solar project in unincorporated areas. The leverage that counties have in those contexts is typically over tax abatements. And even that has sort of changed over time now that you can't get a tax abatement for wind and solar projects for school districts. It's really just tax abatements at the county level. And from a project developer perspective, at least in the wind and solar context, it's like a relatively small amount of tax. So it's not a huge amount of leverage to negotiate that. For data centers, it's a big deal, in part because the data centers are about a factor of 10 greater in terms of the amount of money we're talking about, like hundreds of millions of dollars for a big wind or solar project, at least $1 billion for even a modest sized data center. And for big data centers, you're talking north of $10 billion. And so county taxes are a big factor at that point. So one of the ways that we see in Texas, but especially nationally, developers working collaboratively with local communities, especially where those local communities can hold up their projects, is they enter into what are referred to as community benefits agreements. And these are contracts with the local communities to provide money or to, purchase a fire engine or an ambulance or something like that, or develop a community center. And so these voluntary contractual agreements are really important because they can be a very tangible way in which a developer can demonstrate that they're benefiting the community. They're already benefiting the community by, increasing the tax base, but from the local community perspective, that may not be all that visible to them. And so these agreements can be a really useful way to do that. They're really flexible. They avoid Supreme Court precedent that places restrictions on what communities or counties specifically can demand of developers. But one of the limitations is oftentimes when you enter into agreement, there has to be, each side has to give something. And so one of the weaknesses of a community benefits agreement is the local community is often giving something only nominal, and there's some question about how enforceable they are. But they're very routinely entered into. They're an important mechanism for getting local communities on board. Another thing that local communities and developers negotiate are payments in lieu of taxes. So in Texas in particular, if you're negotiating a tax abatement with a local community, often what that will be joined with is a payment in lieu of taxes. And this is really beneficial to the local community in two particularly important ways. Local taxes tend to, because they're on a depreciation schedule, they're based on the value of the infrastructure that is constructed, and that is depreciated over time. And so the local community is going to get a big chunk of money up front, and then that's going to quickly fall off as the value of the infrastructure depreciates over time. A payment in lieu of taxes, typically the way they're negotiated is it's kind of flat over time. And so they get a fixed amount of money on an annual basis, and they can work that into their county budgets, and they can also direct it to whatever they like. It's also really beneficial to developers because for them, money paid up front, especially when they're paying off the debt on their project, is the most expensive. And so if you can spread out payments over time, that actually has a lower impact on developers, and they can actually be more generous with local communities. And so that flexibility is really valuable. In other states, they allow through legislation local communities to enter into development agreements. And one of the principal benefits of this is, one, it gets around the Supreme Court precedent that I alluded to before, but it also allows early regulatory de-risking of projects. And so basically what the community does here is it says, we're going to agree to certain terms for the development of a project, setbacks, height restrictions, those sorts of things. And we're going to freeze that for you early in your development cycle. And so a developer like Raina is going to know, I know what the terms of my development are relatively early on. I'm de-risking my project at that point. And then on the other side, the quid pro quo for that is some kind of community benefits for the county. The developer gets something really valuable, early de-risking. The community gets, one would hope, kind of enhanced benefits from the siting of the project. This is not currently available in Texas, but it's something that is utilized elsewhere, and developers, all the developers I've talked to, think it's an awesome way to sort of help ensure or promote collaborative decision-making between developers and local communities. I think I'm going to skip this. How are we doing? I'm just sort of thinking about time. Maybe I'll just, how are we doing?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. I just want to, I've talked a little bit about the scale here. This is, an example from Hansford County in the sort of Texas Panhandle, where they have a little bit more than 1,100 megawatts, so a little more than a gigawatt of generation, which is a lot. It's about a $1.6 billion investment. The federal production tax credit value for the project was over $900 million. So there's big federal incentives associated with these projects. And the local taxes over the lifetime of the project are estimated to be about $261 million. So that's a huge benefit to the local community. I'm sort of giving a benchmark using other examples of a community benefits agreement value of about $5.1 million. You can sort of balance, like local taxes are actually, a small, relatively small proportion of the PTC value. This is a pretty small level for a CBA. If you kick the CBA up to about 2% of the revenue, that could be about $79 million or about $2.6 million per year. And part of the work that I do is I do independent financial modeling to help inform local communities when they're negotiating with developers. And this is just sort of trying to give a benchmark between, what's the value of local taxes, what's the value of a potential community benefits agreement, and just focusing on this, if it were $79 million over the lifetime of the project, what would the impact be on the project economics in terms of their rate of return or their PPA price? And so even a CBA of this value, $2.6 million per year, actually has a relatively modest impact on project economics. And if we look at other areas of economic development, like the oil and gas sector, about the equivalent of 4% of their revenue goes into local taxes. They also pay severance taxes at the state level. That's about another 7%. And so part of what local communities and developers are trying to work out is kind of some combination of what are they paying in local taxes, what are they going to be paying in terms of the community benefits agreement or a pilot agreement, and what's like a reasonable amount to expect for the local community. And my sense right now is the local communities don't have a clear sense of that. There's not clear benchmarks for developers as well. And that's something that really, if there were kind of clear expectations and benchmarks, both would make it more tangible and visible for local communities what the benefit to them is likely to be, and also would make negotiations between developers and local communities easier. And that's one of the things I'm trying to work on, and one of the things you could be thinking about from a policy perspective as well. Okay, I'm going to skip this, and then
Okay.
back to you.
Any questions so far? Yep.
That project, that's like enough electricity for, in that area, that would probably be more than one city. Because I'm
Yeah.
thinking those are small towns. So I kind of read everything before coming and also Googled a bunch of stuff. I kind of have this impression generally that having any of these projects near a town strains the town. With so much electricity being produced, are there any projects that are coming up that totally satisfy the needs of that local town? I'm just wondering, this is a question that's constantly coming to me in all these presentations.
It's a good question. Do you want to address
Why
it?
don't you
Okay, yeah, I will, and then you can
Yeah.
a little bit more granularly. She is saying that in her research, this strains the small local community, a project of this size, from a energy perspective. So these utility scale projects, all this load that the generation that they generate, which is significant in this case, way more than the small towns close by, it goes into the ERCOT grid. So the power is wheeled to where it's needed, which is bigger, cities, obviously. And that's why, I don't know if you've seen the CREZ, but everyone, if you aren't aware of the CREZ project, it was a big transmission project, huge investment for the state of Texas and ERCOT. And the purpose of the CREZ lines were to take wind mainly from rural areas, the Panhandle, West Texas, and deliver it into centers of load that need it, like Dallas, Austin, and Houston. So, but ERCOT, and another good resource that I don't know if we've given you or not is the ERCOT platform. It's very actually user-friendly. It gets very detailed, but the cool thing about I think first, when you open it, it shows how much is producing what for our lights to be on in Texas. And so wind and solar, gas plants and coal plants are hundreds of megawatts always. I gave you examples of tiny little solar. Some of you probably have solar on your homes. We have battery cars. We have battery backup in our garages. So we have a lot of distributed resources, which we haven't talked about today, but they're really important. But this is the equivalent of a monster gas plant.
Yeah.
So this is providing a ton into the grid overall for all the electricity needs in Texas. So ERCOT has figured out, and the transmission service providers and all the different players in the system, it's amazing. We were talking about it last night. It's amazing that they can regulate this much current and flow this much current. We have these small communities are not impacted by this project negatively in any way. Their power is through the distributed grid, so it's not on a transmission level. This is full high voltage, high transmission level. The communities have smaller substations. They're part of a distributed generation grid, and that's very well regulated as well, where we often don't, unless there's big catastrophic events, we often don't have the lights go off. So, and again, the reason these big projects have to be so rural is we need this much land. We need, that we just don't have thousands of acres close to city centers. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, the one thing I would say is, there are a number of coal-fired power plants and natural gas-fired power plants that are in relatively rural places too. And they're often viewed as a local asset because they produce jobs and they're part of the local economy. And I would just encourage you to sort of think, and they're some of the coal-fired power plants are close to the scale of, this is actually 3 separate wind projects in the county. So, they're just different forms of economic development. They have different attributes associated with them in terms of their environmental impacts and their impacts on the local community, but they're just different forms of economic development. And just like Raina said, if anything, having more generation on the grid enhances the resiliency of the grid, and therefore should benefit the local community by having more generation sources that allows more economic development, and we all benefit from that.
Going back to development agreements, so 16 states have that in policy as an option. We don't. What are some of those states, and from the perspective of developers, they like this? What's the local perspective from those cities or counties that go into those agreements?
So, I mean, development agreements have been around for a long time, since the early 1980s. They've mostly been used in sort of the urban area for large, complex developments, like, so like a multi-year, even multi-decade mixed-use residential development. They've been used much less in the context of renewables. California's had development agreements the longest, but there's states like Florida and I think South Carolina. I think Virginia has them. Colorado might have them too. It's like a range of states across the country. My sense is the general view is, because it's a contractual agreement, it retains kind of decision-making authority at the local level. It just provides greater flexibility in terms of how they negotiate with developers. And one of the challenges of Supreme Court precedent is, in most cases, unlike, you know, unincorporated areas in Texas, local communities have a holdup right. You have to get a permit through them. But how they negotiate with developers of any kind, you know, wind and solar, any other type of developer, there are strict restrictions on kind of the quid pro quo they can ask for giving a permit. Development agreements avoid that altogether because what the local community is giving is kind of earlier regulatory certainty, and then they can ask for whatever they want in exchange for that.
Yep, go ahead.
I have a follow-up question on that because one of the major strengths, I guess, from the developer's perspective is that regulatory de-risking.
Mm-hmm.
And then, for instance, on the slide it said it's often including zoning, rezoning, but that's not something counties could offer in Texas, right? And that's where a lot of these renewable
No, I mean,
things are going. So what would
yeah.
be some other things that
well, I mean, Raina actually does a fair amount of like smaller scale battery development in incorporated areas, in municipal areas. And so, you know, for data centers, for smaller scale solar, for smaller scale batteries, those can be in unincorporated areas, and this sort of mechanism would be valuable in that context.
Just a quick time check, should we jump into policies?
Sure.
You can skip this.
Yep. Happy to go back over anything. You have a bunch of slides. We're not going to get through it. This is a photo I took from a wind turbine I developed in Lubbock, and it's the only time I've been on top of a wind turbine, and it was terrifying. And our team was on the turbine next to us, and I was like, get down now. Like, it's really, really high up there. Oh, we need power to this computer. Anyway, a Southwest plane like flew right in front of me. I was like, what are we doing? Passionate about wind, and as you know, recycling is a huge part of the session upcoming and just the energy industry in general. So I already touched on decommissioning. There's a lot more to it than I talked about, but it is going to come up, and it's something we're constantly working on every project, but for generally the industry. A couple new guidelines came out, new policies on recycling. Last session, HB 3. We need somebody's fingerprint. So the recycling legislation for wind came out, and that's very important. Like we talked about earlier, large-scale wind development and operations. It's been going on now for 30 years in Texas. So these turbines and blades have met their useful life. They need to be discarded. The kind of the blades are really the issue with recycling. The rest of the wind turbine can be recycled pretty easily. It's metal. The blade is fiberglass, and it has other metals embedded in it. So that is the difficulty, and that is what you'll hear come up, and what really needs guidance. One of the, I think, ironies of renewables and our ability to track life cycles of projects and technologies is that AI and things like that are going to help us to be able to track individual components of each solar cell and blade, so we can actually see the life of it and where it goes and how it's recycled. So there's going to be a lot about that. I think the industry overall hasn't quite been able to take into account the legislative policy guidelines, just because when these projects are at the end of life or when the blades are changed out, it's just it's not all at one time. So I think we'll see continue to see this moving forward. Yep. Thank you. Okay, and so you guys have it on your screen, but obviously 819, if everyone wasn't involved in that, I would highly suggest you go back and look at kind of how it went. Where are we now? Okay. Yep, thank you. So that was permitting for renewable energy projects. It was one of our biggest issues as a renewable developer. It created really setbacks and constraints that would kill so many of our projects, so many of every developer in Texas projects. So lots of projects were at risk, and it just really brought a lot of the pushback of renewables in local communities for whatever reason here to the Capitol. HB 3556, that's the migratory bird impact bill. One of the things that's been interesting about wind over the years, and it's come up in a lot of places where American Farmland Trust is and all these renewable groups, is that we have the Audubon Society that is with us on this and have worked with us, which originally we didn't think that would happen. So it's great to have all the partners and all the players kind of come in agreement on how we can site these projects responsibly. House Bill 3228 and 3229 is the recycling. So like I said, the implementation is and the cost of compliance is a big part of the ramifications of those bills. And then SB 6, which it's the bill of the day. It's going on conversations are going on today about it. It's something, completely different. So it's just batching large loads of interconnects. You're not really in the queue now. You're kind of in a pool. So that's a huge change that we've never seen before to renewables. It's going to be, I think developers just aren't sure. Everybody's trying to get in the first batch, but we just don't know. I don't know if you have thoughts on any of these, but.
That's what I've heard, because it's a 6-year cycle. And so, especially, for any type of developer, if you're not in that first cycle, then you're waiting on the sidelines for 6 years, and 6 years is kind of an eternity. Remember, developers are thinking on timelines of like 3 to 5 years, and they want to be managing multiple projects during that time.
Yeah. Any questions on this discussion? Are we at time? Okay. Okay, yep. So, when we talk about what can be standardized, and we talk about this a lot, but we go to small communities and county commission meetings and city council meetings, and it's like Groundhog Day, where people just, unless there's somebody that's had a project or there's happens to be somebody that's educated on it, people just aren't aware of how this works. So education is, again, so important. I think having kind of a template that we could share would be really great. I know there's organizations that work on stuff like that, but we're seeing it too with this battery fire safety bill. Like, we just have to have something, because we're creating fire safety bills for each project we're doing, and it just really needs to be, let's just replicate and do the best practices. So water use, I don't know how much you want to talk about water use, but just in case we weren't clear, renewables do not use water. It's one of the best benefits of it. They also don't use any fuel source, so you have a renewable resource that's generating electricity without using water and without having to be given fuel to continue. So those are really the highlights of renewable energy. No air pollution as well, so that's the best things. Erosion and drainage, just like any project that you move dirt and install infrastructure, that's a big part of it. Decommissioning and recycling, we're going to see how those bills are implemented. So, you know, agrivoltaics, I know it's kind of my favorite subject, but it is more expensive. Cattle voltaics is a popular thing too, putting cattle, we're seeing that. Garrett knows more than I do about it, but it's more expensive for different reasons. You know, you have to have higher panel, you know, more steel, so it's more expensive, higher panels, but so it would be, you know, incentivizing things like that would benefit across the board. Community solar framework, these are just different policy gaps we see. Fire safety is coming very soon. Transmission planning is kind of a different topic. Setbacks are a big part of probably what will happen and what will be discussed in the next session. We deal with it a lot with our projects, and there's wild variations in what people think should be setbacks for these projects. So, yep. So, and these are key policy issues. I don't know, is this, do you want us to go through this? Is this one of the ones you want to go through? Okay. Do you want to, is this your slide?
It's not my slide.
It's not?
No.
Oh, okay. So, I think this is more discussion, but how do we standardize best practices? It's happened pretty much in the wind industry. When the wind industry was new, we didn't have best practices, and we kind of looked to the oil and gas industry, and they didn't really have best practices. So we created our own, which was like, you know, repair fences, repair roads, you know, repair gates, and be a good neighbor, and really have best practices for development and when you own and operate, when you're a neighbor in communities. Weeding out bad actors, it kind of happens, you know, it takes care of itself generally. Agreements between local governments and developers. One thing I say about this is, you know, you go in and meet the community, you know, meet the mayor, meet the city council, meet the fire department, meet economic development folks as early on as possible, because they don't like, you know, finding out about it. And then we go and ask them for something. They're like, well, you should have come to me from the beginning. So it's a very community-driven development cycle. So, yeah, lots of community engagement. So I have a whole thing on battery safety. We don't have time for it. You have the slides. I'm available for any, you know, questions one-on-one, but I think we're going to do another session, and we'll have more feedback and information even from this morning, I think, on battery safety. Oklahoma's passing a battery safety bill right now. That's a good one to kind of compare to. But this is one of our hottest topics by far right now. So I think we'll go into Q&A on anything. I know you guys are probably hungry. I can't believe you make them wait through this whole thing to eat. That's crazy. Yes.
I think you kind of had a few questions, but would like to hear a little more deeper dive on the intersection of the agrovoltaics per the two different sides of renewables, the wind versus the solar, you know, because I mean, I think you kind of alluded to some of it. Sheep are common with solar, but they're now getting into cattle, but it requires more infrastructure on the solar side. But yet with wind, you have a large concrete patch, you know, and so that obviously will affect grazing capabilities, et cetera, and that kind of stuff. So where is that?
So before solar, utility scale solar happened in Texas, and we were doing wind, agrivoltaics weren't, you know, we didn't ever say, oh, you can't farm or ranch on a wind project. That's kind of one of the best advantages of wind. It's hard to, you know, make farms and ranches financially work for generations. So where we did projects in rural areas, people really loved the benefit of having wind. And I never, had people say, oh, I can't farm, because tractors plow all around wind turbines, and lots of times we'll see sheep and cattle in the shadow of the wind turbine for shade. And so really that is, there's no, the financial benefit to the landowner just makes everything better. So and these are, 10,000 acre ranches. Wind takes up so many more acres, and so solar's it's just such a different technology, and it's just the use of the land is so different. That's why agrivoltaics is such a big deal now, because solar also is taking up 1,000, 2,000 acres. That's a lot of land to be displaced. So that's why agrivoltaics is kind of a thing now, where it wasn't in wind, because we're seeing what can we grow. And there's you can bale hay in between rows of solar. So there are a lot of things that are happening, but I think we'll see more and more. But did that answer your question? It just wasn't a thing with wind. Like, wind just didn't displace enough. Yeah, there's a base, but there's not even a fence around a wind turbine. You can just go right up to it.
Okay, so
Oh yes, please do.
So, I mean, there are multiple points here to consider. One is, like, just if we look at the build out that would be required for solar, wind, there's really not a conflict. And we look at the agricultural land nationally, the net impact would be substantially less than the amount of land we already have dedicated for producing corn-based ethanol, just to give you like a rough sense of things. That's the percentage of land that could be needed, obviously varies from where you are in the country as a whole. But in most states, in terms of the amount of farmland that would be required for a complete build out, like really decarbonizing the grid, it's in the single-digit percentage range. And then you throw on top of that, in places like California is a good place where they've got literally hundreds of thousands of acres of fallow agricultural land because they don't have the water resource to support it. And I'm sure some of that exists in Texas as well. You've just got a huge amount of land that's no longer productive, that's actually really, really good for solar. And then on top of that, there are different grades of agricultural land that are questionable in terms of the net value associated with them. It's still hard for agricultural communities. You're still displacing some production, and there's second order effects associated with that you should be thinking about. But the notion that there's just this inherent conflict between solar development and the amount that we need and agriculture, in the most of the country, it's a very marginal impact that it's going to have. And then agrivoltaics, like wind, mitigate that potential even more. And so you could imagine agrivoltaics are going to matter if you're siting a solar project on really high value agricultural land. And so you spend a little bit more and you allow them to coexist. But there are lots of places where that kind of potential conflict is, I think, much less than many people assume.
And Garrett mentioned the study that they did, and I would encourage everybody that this topic comes up, go to American Farmland Trust website, and they have the results of that study. And that's one of our big misconceptions, right? Is that solar is displacing fertile farmland, and that's a big issue, where really it's urban sprawl is what is displacing agriculture and productive farmland. So.
And I know Zoe has some closing remarks as well, but
Yep.
just want to give a little bit of context too. I know we got a little bit into the weeds today. This is a two-part session, and next week we'll have Raina back to talk, if she wants to talk a little bit more about like those specific stories around development and the specific experiences that have been had. And then we'll have a farmer rancher couple too, again, talking about like what are their specific experiences around all of this, what have they seen happen, and so then we'll be able to kind of go into a little bit more of the kind of what does the policy space look like and where could it go So I know this was a little bit like, okay, why are we learning the federal, permitting process? It sort of builds into the next session. So just to give that context before passing it off.